It's my pleasure to announce this session today. This opening plenary session is designed as a President-invited lecture, and it's named after Harry Campion. And Harry Campion was a very illustrious former President of the Society, and he was brought in by Winston Churchill in 1941 to help Winston Churchill understand the confusion that was caused by a new data revolution at that time, which was competing parties coming to him with different sorts of evidence, trying to persuade him what to do at a very important time in the country's history. And he wanted someone to help him make sense of this plethora of information that was exploding all around him and making it very difficult for him to make sense of what should happen next. Now, does that sound familiar to us now? I think Harry would have been very happy we were having this discussion today at another stage where a data revolution is sweeping us, where we are often very confused about what to do about it, and very perplexed, perhaps, in how statisticians and statistics can rise to a challenge which in some ways is quite threatening, but also quite exciting for us. So I was very pleased when Richard Allan agreed to be our guest lecturer today. Richard and I have known each other for about 10 years now, and I first knew him when he was an MP for this city, and we know he has at least one of his former voters in the audience. I guess there are many more, but obviously his connection with Sheffield is a great one. It's nice to welcome you back here. But Richard was also the chair of the House of Commons Information Committee, looking at the way information was used in the political process, both from a kind of technological aspect, but also from a using statistics aspect, which is what is of most interest to us. But in 2010, Richard stood down as an MP in 1997, and Nick Clegg is now the member for the seat that he held. And he went off to work for Cisco and Facebook, and in 2010 became Lord Allan of Hallam, and I've been working with him since in that capacity too. So he's still very interested in politics. He's definitely very interested in information. He's very interested in statistics and us. I'm very grateful to him coming to us today, and I look forward to hearing his lecture. Richard, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction, John, and I want to echo Mike's welcome to Sheffield. This is my home city. I was born in a hospital not very far from here, which has since been swallowed up by the university. Actually quite emblematic of what's happened in Sheffield, where during my lifetime it's changed from being a steel city. I was born towards the end of that era, and my father was made redundant from the steel industry. So I was had lots of echoes of that end of an era. If you've seen the film The Full Monty, which we debated endlessly in Sheffield, did it represent the city well or not? It did, to a certain extent, represent a particular era. And we've become very much a knowledge-based city. The growth of the two universities here has transformed the place, physically as well as intellectually. And it's a delight to be here and be here in the City Hall, which is, again, a venue that holds a lot of memories for me. As a teenager, before many of the other Sheffield venues were built, this was the place you came for concerts. And then it became the place where one would come and enjoy the pantomime every Christmas, to which I expect people to say, oh, no, you didn't. I used to come to the pantomime here. Thank you. And for those who are not familiar with pantomime, because I understand people have traveled from far and wide, come back to the United Kingdom in December or January, go to any major city, look for the pantomime, go and be amazed. You will be. The Manor Operatic Society one in Sheffield is particularly a fine example. So it's slightly intimidating to be here on the stage of this place that holds so many memories for me. That sense of intimidation only increased when I read your program and saw the kind of talks and lectures that you're going to be having over the next 2 days. I do not pretend to be an expert on statistics. I would pretend to have some knowledge about the internet sector and about public policy and how those two interact with each other. So I'm going to talk today about how I think your work and work of data scientists in particular, who are people that are hired by my company in significant numbers, many of whom are statisticians, how that work impacts on our company, and then perhaps draw some lessons from that I hope will feed into your discussions over the next couple of days. So I was struck very much by the slogan that I've seen everywhere, data, evidence, decisions. And that actually seems to be a very robust slogan for both aspects of the work that I do, both the work that I do inside a company, where we're trying to make decisions that make people love our products more. And that's essentially what it's about. We try and use data to create products that people will love. We have a word, delight. If we get our job right, people experience a sense of delight when they use the products and services that we offer. But it's also the case that in the government work that I do, again, I think data evidence decisions, and I know you heard from Sir Mark Walpole last year about that, data evidence decisions should be at the heart of government decision making. I'm not sure many governments would go as far as saying that they want their services to be delightful, but perhaps that's an aspiration that they should have. When I apply for my passport, I should be delighted by the way in which that's processed speedily and delivered to me on time. And there's no reason not to aspire to that. So data evidence decision-making is, I think, critical to everything that we do as a business and should be critical to everything we do within government. So I'll start by just describing Facebook's scale briefly. Many of you will be familiar with the company, but it's worth just recapping on the scale. We just had our 10th birthday. My original note said that makes us 117 years younger than the Royal Statistical Society, but I spoke to John earlier and he corrected me. It makes us 170 years earlier because I was dating it from the Royal Charter, not the Foundation. So we are 170 years younger than the Royal Statistical Society. We've just had a 10th birthday. In 2004, we ran a service with around 1 million people using it, all of them in the United States and generally within quite a confined community. By 2007, that had risen to 58 million people, again, largely confined to the English-speaking world and restricted audiences. By 2009, that had reached 360 million people. There'd been a big push forward. That's actually when I joined the company, and there was a big transition around internationalization. Actually, language and making services available in multiple languages is a critical decision point for all companies to take. Internet companies, even those that originate in non-English speaking countries, will tend to appeal to the English-speaking audience. It's the large and generally most connected audience they can appeal to, and then they'll experience a growth phase where they go and localize into different languages. By 2012, we reached the 1 billion mark, and at the end of June this year, we're at 1.32 billion people. And again, just to understand what that means, we calculate our statistics based on the number of people who have accessed the service at least once in the last 30 days. So that 1.32 billion people are people who have accessed Facebook at some point in the last 30 days. We're also increasingly interested in those who come back every day. And that number is now at 829 million. So those are people who return to the service pretty much on a daily basis. And increasingly important to us is mobile, and I'll go on to touch on a bit more on that, but if you think of the internet sector, the transition to mobile is rapid and increasing. And increasingly, and it's probably true in your own daily lives, that there is more internet access via mobile in most countries, and in some countries there is only internet access via mobile. So that becomes an increasingly important part of the things we're doing, and is changing our mindset from thinking of big screens in fixed locations to thinking of small screens pulled out anywhere. And actually for social networking, it makes more sense. If you are at a wedding or the birth of a baby, it's quite normal to pull out a camera phone and post the photo. Pulling your laptop out would be a bit weird. So there are simply inherent value, there's inherent value within mobile devices that for a lot of internet services make them better than traditional fixed computing devices. They also have great advantages like things like location, which actually is now increasingly important. So we have, of those folks, 1.07 billion, so just over 1 billion of those people use our service on mobile over the last 30 days, and of those 654 million have used it on mobile every day. So that's the community in a way that's the representative and most interesting community now. Around half of our user community are people who use it on mobile every single day. So this translates into massive activity and massive data, which we'll get to in a moment, but the activity is around things that are of relevance to people's daily lives. And that's not something which we as Facebook dictate. What's relevant to you in your daily life is something that you dictate or you determine personally, and it can be everything from the traditional family event, the classic weddings, babies, all of those kind of things, through to events of great significance, protests that are being organized right now in Hong Kong. They will involve people connecting through services, not just ours, but services like ours. Obviously, the momentous events of the Arab Spring involve people connecting through services like ours. Again, the service doesn't create the political activity. The political activity is down to individuals, but they now simply have tools that enable them to do that in a more efficient and speedier way than they ever did before. So people determine those events, and then they will share information around those events. And a lot of the work we're doing is trying to understand those patterns of behavior better so that we can design our service to meet those needs. A recent example would be the World Cup. So we did some quick analysis after the World Cup, and between June the 12th and July the 13th, the period of the World Cup, we looked at the data the activity that took place around that. We found that 350 million people within our user community had engaged in some activity that we could identify as related to the World Cup, and we estimated that there were around 3 billion interactions. So those are posts, comments, likes, interactions with properties that belong to the players or the teams on Facebook or with other people on Facebook. So for one single event, albeit an interesting large-scale global event, we're talking about a conversation that takes place, broadly speaking, between 350 million people around the world involving 3 billion interactions. And that's taking place against a background of the general population of 1.3 billion interacting frequently on a daily basis. So having set the context on scale, I wanted to describe some of the challenges where we use data to inform the decisions that we make. The first is around newsfeed. If you're familiar with Facebook, newsfeed is the piece in the middle of the screen where you get a scrolling update. It's a personalized newspaper based on things that you've connected to. So they could be people that you've connected to. They could be what we call pages, groups. There are all sorts of spaces on Facebook where you could have made a connection, and those connections can send information through to your newsfeed, and you can view it. And there is a model of newsfeed. It's the most popular part of the service. There's a model of newsfeed where you can simply see everything. So friend posts something, straight to newsfeed. Page posts something, straight to newsfeed. And then the information will simply scroll down. But what we found is that as people engage on the platform and create more connections, more linkages, obviously the number of potential items increases. And so the estimate we've made is that for a typical user, there could be around 1,500 items coming through to their newsfeed on a daily basis. And so a lot of the work that we've done is based on trying to make that as relevant as we can. Again, our estimate is that a reasonably active user could read, could view, could interact with around 300 of those items. So the challenge for us is how do we select the 300 items out of those 1,500 that are most interesting and relevant to the person who's viewing it. And we build a bunch of models around that, essentially looking at interactions, trying to understand relevance to people. Our goal is to make sure that nothing important is missed. If a close friend of yours suddenly announces that they're getting married or they're about to become a parent, and that doesn't appear in your newsfeed, you're going to be angry. You're going to be excluded from that conversation. You're going to think our service is not meeting your requirements. It will not be delightful. Equally, if your newsfeed fills up with content that comes from a page that you liked a year ago that you're no longer interested in, you haven't interacted with for 11 months and 30 days since the first time you clicked like on that page, again, it's not going to be a great experience. So we're using a whole range of signals that we get from the way in which people interact with other people and the content that they take an interest in to try and pick out the 300 items of the 1,500 in broad terms that will be of most relevance to them and make sure that those are seen first and seen most prominently. And that requires a process of constant refinement, occasionally controversial, and we've had some controversy in the headlines around some of the tests that we've run on that. But you have to imagine a service on which, on a daily basis, we are running constant tests saying, okay, do we weight previous interactions with individuals of this category more heavily than we weight some other form of engagement, the number of other people that have liked that piece of content. So constant testing of that. And then we get a constant feedback loop, which is when we show the content to people, again, the system will tell us how frequently people read them, how frequently they engage with that content. And we're trying to make that as relevant and as interesting as possible. So newsfeed is a big, big area for us to use data to inform the decisions about how content is shown to people. And again, I'm aware that it raises a bunch of interesting questions around the extent to which people are aware of that process of presenting information to them. They're aware of that process of constant refinement. Again, I say it's not a Facebook issue specifically. It's an issue, I actually think, for all internet services. So if you run a basic website, you can do a certain amount of this. We're really at the most sophisticated end, in a sense, of what anybody can do. Since the first website was built and you got these statistics coming through, people have looked at their website and said, how many people commented on my blog? How many people engaged with this? They could look at the stats and see where the visitors came from and what content they viewed. So we're really at that sophisticated end of things, but essentially any internet service will be doing something along the spectrum. And the largest internet services, I think, will be most sophisticated. Search engines typically will do, again, a very sophisticated model of trying to understand what is most relevant content to the person who searches for a particular term. BBC website will be constantly thinking about which news articles to place where in order to create the most interesting and useful experience to people. So newsfeed is a big area where data is informing decision making. I think the second area is around bad behavior. And again, talking to John, I understand you've been looking at things like insurance companies and other folks, and indeed this is an area where some of this kind of thinking would, I think, be relevant for government. Anyone who is trying to prevent abuse of a system. One of the great joys of online systems is that they act remotely. I can sit there with my mobile phone anywhere in the world and I can access a service. That also creates a great risk area that previously where somebody had to walk through a door into a building, I saw that person, I was able to make assessments about that person, and then I could decide my strategy in dealing with them by the physical presence of that person. I had some kind of engagement. We're now dealing with services where anybody anywhere can access the service at any time. And there's certain forms of bad behavior, abuse of our services that we need to be able to respond to. The classic one for us is people creating accounts which are not genuine, but for some kind of malicious purposes. At the lower end, it would be spamming. I create an account so I can try and sell something that's called Viagra but spelt differently in order to try and get through filters to people across the internet. That's the sort of low end of the spectrum. At the hard end of the spectrum, it's people creating accounts for sort of serious malicious and illegal activity, and we have a huge incentive to make sure that those people don't get on the system. And the challenge here for any internet service is false negatives can be extremely damaging. That's people getting onto your service and doing things that are very, very harmful to users because you have failed to catch them. But equally, false positives can be extremely frustrating for individuals. They're locked out by security systems through no fault of their own as they see it, so they feel a great sense of injustice, quite rightly, and then they want the service to deal with that. So this is an area where data is critical to us to understand that. Because of the scale at which we're operating, we need to understand particular patterns of activity, particular forms of illegitimate access to our service, and then we have a team called the Site Integrity Team, whose job it is to make sure that we limit the scope for people getting onto the service illegally or for illegal purposes, at the same time minimizing the false positives that we get and the amount of people who are locked out inappropriately. Again, if you use the Facebook service and you travel, you may experience some of this. If you're in a strange location, not your usual location, we will use data in order to inform us as to whether or not it is likely that access is inappropriate. So, there are certain countries where there's a consistent pattern of behavior, and if somebody who always logs in from the United Kingdom logs in from country X, that may be a strong enough signal for us to say you need to go through another security checkpoint. One of the great tools that we use here is the much maligned cookie. People get very obsessed about cookies on websites. One thing that I've learned is that from a security point of view, cookies are wonderful. They are your best friend because they essentially tell us that a particular device is a device that we know, and they give us a history of access by that device. So if you are a Facebook user or you use other services with comparable security mechanisms and you're offered something called login authentication or two-factor authentication, please do put it on. What that essentially says is, we have a cookie on your device. We know that's your device. We know that you log in from it regularly. We don't need to put extra security measures on. If you log in from a strange device we've not seen before, and we know it's strange because it hasn't got a cookie on it, we'll be able to put in extra security measures. And one of those is to say to you, this is a strange device, is it yours? We send you a text message. If you say it's yours, then we know to let that in. So that kind of technology of using cookies, of using data, of using mechanisms where we can come back to you and ask you a question if we need to are critical to the way in which we control inappropriate access. The second kind of bad behavior is people have accessed the system, but they're posting content or sharing content which breaches our terms. Again, ranging from illegal content through to content that offends people in a way that crosses a line. A certain amount of offense is permissible, certainly within our system, but there are certain things, for example, hate speech, where you've crossed a line that's clearly prohibited in our terms, and we need to be able to deal with that. This is actually an interesting area where we found that algorithms are not great. Essentially, the way the system works for us is that you can report content across the service. It will come to us, and then it goes for human review. There is a popular myth out there which says, if you report something 100 times or 200 times or 500 times, we'll take it down. That's based on the assumption this is algorithmically driven, that we say, oh, we got so many reports, it's bad content, take it down. We actually learned very early on that people will spend hours and hours reporting stuff in order to get at somebody else, and that therefore these kind of numerical systems just don't work. People will game the system every time. So they're the interesting question for us, and again, it's a challenge of not having false negatives, not having false positives. People get really upset if you take their content down, and you shouldn't have done. They get really upset if you leave content up that's blatantly against our terms. But the question there for us and the models that we run are around how many times do you need to do human review in order to make a decision which then sticks. So essentially the model will be human reviews it first time it's reported. Great, make a decision. Human reports it second time it's reported, they make a decision. If decision 1 and decision 2 both support, both go in the same direction, then is that enough? Or do we need to then review it a third time, a fourth time? Where do we stop? How do we make those calculations in order to try and, say, get to an accuracy rate, which our goal would be sort of 5 nines kind of accuracy rate on those decisions. Again, think of the scale at which we operate. 3 billion interactions around the World Cup. If all of those were reported to us and we got it wrong in a tiny fraction of 1% of cases, that's a lot of angry and upset people. So again, because of scale, we need to get those decisions as right as we can, and that's a constant goal. But I say there it's about numbers of times that we need to do human review to be confident about our decision making. The last area I wanted to just touch on was around commercial activity. And there's been an interesting transition. So commercial activity supports platforms like Facebook, makes them free at the point of use. Again, for some people that's controversial, but we found, and all the evidence we have from speaking to the people who use our services, that this is the most acceptable model. It's very like the commercial television model in the sense that if you say to people, would you like your commercial television without adverts? They'll say, yes, that would be better. If you say to them, would you like to pay for what is currently a free-to-air commercial television service? They say, no, thank you, I'll stick with the adverts. And we're in a space there, really, for most internet services where the business model is free at the point of use, funded by advertising. And that's something that we do. Some people talk about the currency for that being the data. Actually, the currency is the attention. The currency is the fact that people come back to your service every day and look at it. It's no good having data if nobody ever comes to your service. So we essentially are sharing attention or offering people the opportunity to buy the attention of the people who come to the Facebook service for a period of time by having a story in the news feed that is an advertising, a commercially funded story. That story is driven by data, or the value of that story can be enhanced by data. So for example, I'm here in Sheffield. We have a Sheffield group of users, which is actually Sheffield plus roundabout. There'll be about 1 million people in that cluster. If I was running a cycle shop in Sheffield and I wanted just to get the attention of the people who like cycling in this area, I can put that into the Facebook service, and I think it's about 188,000 people who are identified as being in the Sheffield area and like cycling. So what I'm paying Facebook for is not the data of those 188,000 people. I'm paying Facebook to capture some of the attention of those 188,000 people and put something in front of them. And in the same way, I can go to a search engine and capture the attention of people who are searching for the term cycling and so on. Most internet services operate in a broadly similar way. The data challenge for us there these days is unpicking the way in which these different moments where you capture people's attention added value to that transaction. So I run my cycling shop in Sheffield. Somebody comes in and buys a bicycle. I may actually have bought advertising on Facebook. I may have bought advertising on the search engine. I may have bought advertising in other spaces on the internet. And in order for me to understand the value and place the value on those different forms of advertising, I need to know a little bit more about how each of them contributed to the eventual purchasing decision, which is what I'm interested in. And so there's a whole area of work going on now which takes us from the old model. It used to be like simple click. Did they click it? So you had this model cost per click. You put an advert up there, somebody clicked it, they bought something, great, job done. I work out the calculation. And that still holds true to a certain extent in some areas. If you look at the app economy on mobile phones, there are ads that say, hey, you should install this app. You click on the ad, you go to the app store, you install the app, really simple transaction. You kind of understand and can value that. If you've got more money for the app than you pay for the ad, you've won, everyone's happy. But I say for most online advertising goods and purchases now, it's a much more sophisticated environment. People are spending days or weeks browsing. You think of something like a car purchase. You think of all the sort of interactions that take place on the internet in the lead up to a car purchase, and people are trying to use data now to unpick where each of those interactions had an impact on the eventual purchasing decision. So a big area that's quite important, again, not just for Facebook, but for every developer of an internet service. So having walked through some examples of our data evidence decision-making processes, I wanted now just to talk for the last few minutes about some of the policy issues that are generated by this kind of activity. Facebook is often used as a totem for the policy discussions, even though, as I say, they apply to all of us and they will apply to all of you if you're working with data in any sense at all. There was so much the totem that there is. The big story at the moment is a review of the European data protection regulation, which has now been going on for 2 years and is likely to close perhaps next year. And there was a time when some people in Brussels were talking about it as the Lex Facebook, which actually is, I think, kind of misguided because they say the law doesn't say if you are Facebook, you have to do A, B, and C. The law says if you use data, you must do A, B, and C. So it's of much broader relevance than simply to us. But it's clearly driven by political concerns and interests in the kind of activities that are taking place, the kind of activities I've described on a service like Facebook. And it's interesting for me, I work in a space where we work across jurisdictions. So there is a framework in the United States for managing data, a framework in Europe, and a framework in other countries. There's a lot of play made of the difference between the regulatory frameworks in the US and the European Union, which I think sometimes is overstated. I mean, broadly speaking, I'd say that the United States has a framework which says, let's give people general guidance and wait to see if something bad happens. And if something bad happens, we then step in. And it's the Federal Trade Commission that steps in, and what they're looking for are unfair or deceptive practices. That's what brings them in. In the European Union, we say, here's a whole set of rules that you must follow in order to prevent the bad things from happening in the first place. And the focus is on, are you following all the things in the rules? And they reflect, in a sense, very different historical experiences. Europe has had some very powerful experiences of people using data to do bad things, whether that was in the fascist past in the run-up to the 1940s, or whether that was in our more recent communist past in Eastern Europe, indeed the fascist past in Southern Europe that persisted through to the 1970s. So we have a real experience. We want to prevent the bad things happening, and the bad thing often being government abuse of data in order to harm their own citizens. The United States never had that experience. So they're more content, I think, broadly speaking, to have a regime that says allow things to flourish and then step in if and when the bad things happen. But I think both regimes, and actually the interests of business, are all geared towards one basic concept, which is no surprises. The thing that really irritates people if there are surprises. So they want to know if they engage in a transactional relationship with a particular entity, whether that's a university or a commercial business or a government, and their expectations are met. If I want to get a passport from my government, I need to give the government all my personal data in order to get that passport. The government gives me a passport back with my personal data on it. They don't send that personal data off to a commercial company. There are no surprises in that transaction. Another business may require different sets of data. As long as they're meeting my expectations, we're doing okay. And the big open questions now are really about how in this world of complexity that I've described, you can do that. given that just the description of a few of the things that we do takes half an hour this morning, how does one get sufficient attention of people in order to inform them, in order for them not to be surprised? I mentioned earlier the transition to mobile, and that's absolutely critical. If you install the latest version of your popular app store on a popular mobile phone, I noticed the other day the terms of service says page 1 of 54. When you get there, it's 54 pages. Other people have done studies recently looking at trying to calculate the number of hours you would need to spend in order to read the privacy policies and terms of service of all of the services that you install on a typical mobile phone, or indeed government services anywhere else. I mean, the reality is you need to have those terms, and they need to be 54 pages long because, legally speaking, that's required of you. But no one's ever going to read them. So having accepted that, we now need to find new ways to communicate with people to get their consent, to help them to understand what it is we're going to do. From our point of view, we've been experimenting with what we call contextual information or bite-sized information. So at the point at which I use something, the first time I upload a photo and say I want to share it with the whole world, we say to you, hey, if you share your photo with the whole world, it means this. That's actually helpful and useful to people and can fit on a small screen. It's covered in our terms, it's written there in several paragraphs, but trying to find ways to present that immediately and in a bite-sized way, I think, is the challenge for us and every other service. So the question is going to be whether we end up with a regulatory framework, I think, that sort of encourages that kind of behavior, or a regulatory framework that's going to direct us much more to, okay, now in future, the rule is going to say that the individual has to do a checkbox on every one of those 54 pages. And that's perfectly sort of, from a regulatory point of view, legitimate way to go, to say everyone must read everything. But in the world in which we operate, getting everyone to read everything, you can imagine, might cause a certain amount of friction. So there's going to be a huge debate, I think, around that coming up. There's some major debates about pseudonymous and anonymous data. Facebook's in an interesting position that we cannot pretend in any sense that our data is pseudonymous or anonymous, because we say to you, you must sign up with your real identity. So we've accepted that. We work within the European Data Protection Framework. We accept that the data we hold, by and large, is personal data. There's plenty of other activity taking place where people are collecting data, and they would contest today that it's anonymous or pseudonymous. Again, there are other people who are contesting that, and maybe some in the room who are looking at it and saying, look, it's easy to reverse engineer identity now from the size of the data pools we have. And the current phrasing of the EU language says, data which is personally identifiable or together with other data could be made personally identifiable should be regarded as personally identifiable. So again, some big questions there around the extent to which, with modern technology, one can make data pseudonymous or anonymous and therefore exempt it from the kind of regulation that organizations like ours face. So big questions. I said at the beginning, I'm not an expert in your field, and my words today may have supported that assertion that I'm not an expert in the field of data, but I hope they provide some useful food for thought as you embark on your proceedings over the next 2 days. Data evidence decision-making, this chain that you have here, is essential to everyone who works in the internet space and becoming increasingly so. We are hiring more and more people with skills in this area. We need them. They're fundamental to what we do. And I think we're balancing up our hiring between engineers. We need software engineers who know how to work these large data sets, with people with pure statistical skills who can help with the analysis, with people who've got hybrid skills. That's an increasingly, I think, significant profession for our sector. And those people are expert in the kind of work that you do here. They will appreciate it to a degree that I can't do. So we're very grateful for the fact that the RSS organizes this event and the fact that there are so many people here contributing to the discipline. So I'd like to thank you for your interest this morning and thank John again for the invitation, and finally thank Mike for the vote. I think it made all the difference way back then in '97. So thank you.
Now, we do have some time for questions, and so questions as statisticians, as citizens, and as Facebook users, I guess. The first one I see is down here in the middle.
Jane Hutton, University of Warwick. Thank you. That's extremely interesting. So some of my questions, I thought about it because I am not and do not intend to become a Facebook user. This question may sound facetious, but it's not intended to be. What do you understand by data science? What's your definition?
So actually, Well, I'm going to put a question back, because as I was preparing for the event, I was reading some of the material around data science versus statisticians. Because at Facebook, we don't have people called statisticians, but we have people called data scientists. And I was trying to understand the distinction. But it seems to me that when I look at our hiring patterns, we recognize that there are different disciplines. So data science is a broader pool of people who together will come together with mixed skill sets, central to which is statistical skill sets, but also, say, software engineering, these other skill sets, to enable us in a rigorous way to make these decisions that perhaps were made much more on an instinctive basis. And so if you look at some of the work we've been doing, I don't think you need to be a Facebook user to read it, but on Facebook itself, there is a data science page. And our team is very open about what they do. And they explain precisely this, that we have people across the company, engineers, who are experimenting with something. They've got, button of size A, button of size B, classically A/B testing. They're doing it all the time. They are trying to inject a rigor into that. So the data science is injecting rigor into what would take place in a company like ours on a normal basis. In order to inject that rigor, they need to have the kind of methodologies that statisticians have and engineers typically don't have.
Hi, Stephen Gilmore, University of Southampton. You referred briefly to the experiments Facebook were performing and the bad publicity surrounding that. I just wondered, something like that, which I think to most technical people seems obviously a good idea, but generates rather overblown stories in the media. Do you push back against that, or do you accept it, or do you ignore it? And how does Facebook react to that sort of thing?
And I think you have a session on designing good experiments for social media later on in the conference. So it is difficult for us. I mean, we do experiments all the time as part of our normal business. We think our motivation is sound for that. It's essentially trying to make a better product and service. Almost given the nature of the beast, when we do things, they will generate a lot of headlines, a lot of interest. Our reaction, frankly, is to learn from that. I mean, again, it's back to the no surprises thing. If people are surprised at what we're doing, that's a problem for us. It leads to negative feelings about our product and service. So we try to explain what it is that we're doing, and I think we've actually put out a huge amount of information. Ironically, that story came out because we were quite open about the research we're doing. Had we been closed about it, then no one would have known about it. But again, if you're interested, there's a publications page on the Facebook site, and there's a huge number of publications where our people have worked with external people to try and further knowledge more generally. But that does expose us, because people can pick any of that up, can create a story from it, and then we need to react to it. So we want to be empathetic to people's concerns. If they were surprised, that's not good, and we need to think about how not to surprise them in future. But at the same time, we don't want to stop doing things which we fundamentally believe are in the interest of the people who use the service. And we're trying to get that balance right now. Sometimes it's best to keep your head down if you can't win because the climate is wrong. But we actually want to advance that debate with people who work in this area.
Sorry, me again, Jane Hutton. I was wondering how you define hate speech. Clearly, it's not just within Facebook, it's controversial, because sometimes I've looked at statements that have been regarded as hate speech and thought, well, if I took a mathematical approach to this, they've said X doesn't like Y, to simplify, and because X is, say, people in Sheffield, and Y is Islam, it's hate speech. But if you swap those two items round, it would not be hate speech. And I suspect you can guess a number of the areas where this is controversial and where, when I look at it dispassionately, there seems to be a lot of inconsistency. So is hate speech defined in that sort of rigorous, logical way when you get the human person looking at things? Or does it depend more on, we know that in, well, Rotherham there'll be things we can't or can say, particularly current issue, that we would be allowed to say in London?
So the technical response is today, and if you look at our terms, again, community standards expose this to people. We follow the normal legal definitions of protected categories. And you're right, protected categories includes religion, nationality. It doesn't include city. So we follow those definitions today, and I think most services do. It's the sort of orthodox approach to dealing with hate speech. If we have an aspiration, I think our aspiration when we build our standards is to try and permit as much speech as possible. So we're broadly speaking a pro-free speech platform, whilst minimizing harm as far as possible. It's that balance. And so, where speech is harmful, so hate speech that is harmful, directly harmful, is the most problematic kind of speech. So let's all go out and kill people of type X. That's problematic. Actually, if it was, let's go and kill people in Sheffield, we could deal with that if it's a credible threat of violence. Just the same, it wouldn't be hate speech, but it would still be a credible threat of violence. And we want to permit, sort of broad language that's used. But again, trying to draw that line, it's an area where, frankly, we're criticized from both sides on a regular basis. So we will get people who say we're too permissive, and we'll get people who say we're too restrictive. Our goal in all of this, I say, is trying to get that balance right between as much speech as is reasonable, as is possible, whilst not allowing our platform to be used for things which are directly, and in the terms of hate speech, perhaps, evidentially indirectly harmful to other groups of people.
This will be the last one in the middle here. Yeah.
Okay, this is another citizen question, not a stats question. Yeah. We seem to be living in a dream or a nightmare where governments have lost control of the information that's available to their citizens. And I've heard it argued that that is transient and that governments will regain control quite soon, that this free-for-all on the internet and the web is not going to last. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a really, I've sort of been involved in these political debates for a long time, and the one that I keep going back to is around identity cards. Whatever people think of identity cards, the government at the time would say, identity cards are fine because you give all your data to Sainsbury's. And yet I instinctively know that my relationship with Sainsbury's and the government is different. I can choose between Sainsbury's and other people, and I know people have questions around choice, but the reality is even a large and potentially significant internet company like Facebook feels very much in its heart and soul that people can choose to use Snapchat or whatever, anything else out there. So I can choose with non-government agencies, I can't choose with a government agency. Sainsbury's can't arrest me. Whereas the government can. The range of powers the government has is quite different. And so I think you are seeing, and again, we're seeing in the debate, we've not mentioned him today so far, but no conversation these days on data can not mention Mr. Edward Snowden. But in the debate post those revelations, again, I've heard a lot of people from government say, it's okay for government to get all this data because you're giving it to Facebook anyway. And again, I'd say that's actually completely different. The power relationship between me and Facebook, however important Facebook is just fundamentally different from the power relationship between me and a government. So I think there is definitely a move on the part of governments. And actually, again, an interesting sort of note on the reaction to those revelations is that there are groups of citizens and activists who are very exercised and saying we must reduce government power. There are lots of people in government who are saying, I want what the NSA has. I want the same amount of data, why can't I have it? And so there's going to be a huge debate, I think, over the next couple of years. The UK is going to be at the center of it, about whether we shift our legislation to do precisely what you say, which is government says, I now want everything that the private sector's got, or whether we shift it in the other direction and actually limit government power further. But it's open. There are strong lobbies on both sides. And I don't think the debate is in any way settled. It really will be a question of political agency by everybody who cares about this stuff over the next year or two. Big open question for me is how many people actually care about it when we come down to the nitty-gritty of framing legislation.
Thank you. I think that probably is a conversation that will be carried on over coffee, and it is now time for coffee. So all it remains for me to do is thank Richard very much for a very interesting and provocative starter to our conference. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.